Trade imbalance is not merely the result of differences in technology or productivity. It often stems from disparities in income distribution within each society, where workers and retirees are forced to spend less than what they are rightfully due, while wealth accumulates in the hands of those who already have more than enough. This passage is excerpted from the book Trauas W., which offers a completely different view from how we usually think about international economics. Instead of discussing tariffs or exchange rates as dry tools, this book delves into what is rarely acknowledged: the silent war over power and interests within the heart of each nation. That is the story of China, channeling the majority of its reform gains into businesses and local governments, forcing hundreds of millions of households to tighten their belts to fuel exports. That is the story of Germany, where labor reforms provided people with jobs but low wages, suppressing purchasing power so that surplus production could flow out to the world. And that is also the story of the US, a country seemingly enjoying the dollar's privilege, but in reality having to bear debt, job losses, and financial bubbles because it is forced to absorb the surplus of the entire planet. When reading these pages, one feels like walking through a long hallway, where each door opened reveals another paradox. Why does a nation that has a larger trade surplus find its people feeling poorer? Why is the currency hailed as the world's strongest associated with the weakening of the domestic middle class? And why are the closed factories in Ohio closely linked to the excess savings in Beijing or Berlin? The book does not promise easy answers. It forces the reader to confront a hard-to-accept reality. Global trade is not a fair competition between nations, but a direct consequence of distribution choices within each society. Domestic inequality becomes surplus on the international balance sheet, which then reflects as crises elsewhere. The question posed is also the ignition for the discussion. If the root lies in inequality, can tariffs, trade agreements, or "my country first" slogans solve anything? Or are we treating the symptom while the root continues to crack? And before getting into the book review, we encourage listeners to buy and read the book to fully grasp its content. Only when you read this entire book will you understand the issues you are hearing me recount. Please buy the book and support the author. Now, let's start reviewing this book with me. In the past, when trade was still slow and costly, the economic world was like a small marketplace, where everything had to be transported by wind power, horsepower, and human power. In that confined space, a Scottish scholar stepped in and observed a small pin factory where hands separated each stage of work to create a seemingly meaningless item. Simply by breaking down labor, productivity multiplied manifold. From a trivial image, he recognized a grand law. Humankind becomes wealthy not because they do everything, but because they know how to let go, focus on what they do best, and then trade the rest. That story inaugurated an era of theory. But then half a century later, a wealthy English financier who got rich through bold bets discovered another paradox. He proved that even if one nation does everything better than another, trade can still benefit both sides, provided each side knows how to focus on the sector where they have a comparative advantage. His example was simple. The Portuguese were better at making wine than the English, and also better at making cloth. But if they focused on wine and the English specialized in cloth, both would be wealthier than trying to do everything. However, theory often looks beautiful only on paper. That wealthy Englishman still lived in an era where capital struggled to flow across borders. News traveled slower than a galloping horse. He could not imagine a world where the components of a product could circle through a dozen nations before reaching the consumer. In his mind, nations were still large households trading finished products, not fragments of the value chain. Across the ocean, a young revolution had just succeeded, a newly independent but still fragile nation. Surrounded by enemies and lacking industry, a young statesman with sharp vision understood that if the nation relied only on agricultural products, it would forever remain dependent. He wrote a long report, proposing the erection of tariffs to nurture the nascent industry. In his view, protection was not just about protecting businesses, but also about protecting the newly gained independence. That was a voice completely different from the praise of free trade across the Atlantic. Many years later, a German who was exiled to the US, witnessing the powerful rise of industry there, learned that lesson. He realized that free trade was not always the path to prosperity. For weak nations, it was nothing short of opening the door for the giant to swallow the small. Only when they reached comparable strength could they talk about equality. And so from the US to Europe, the idea of protectionism was fanned into a flame that changed the trajectory of the entire century. Then the world entered a phase full of tension. Starting in the 1870s, major nations competed to erect tariff walls, protecting domestic markets and expanding colonies. Global trade began to shrink relative to the size of the economy. Political and military power intertwined with economics, creating closed trading blocs. Goods, capital, and people moved not only for profit, but also by the command of guns and flags. Things did not stop there. Two great wars erupted, shattering all the fragile exchanges that remained. When the guns fell silent, humanity was forced to build a new order. International agreements and conferences established rules so that trade would no longer be a struggle leading to conflict. But in reality, the flow of goods remained heavy and sluggish. The problem lay in logistics. Unloading a cargo ship back then could take an entire week, paying wages for hundreds, even thousands of workers. Those costs inflated the price of goods many times. It was in that deadlock that the container appeared as a universal language, a code of global trade. Identical steel boxes that could be stacked and transported by truck, train, or ship. That simplicity paved the way for an explosion. People began reorganizing the entire production chain. Components could now start at a factory in Japan, pass through an assembly line in South Korea, stop in Germany for more technology, then go to China for final assembly. The finished product bore the label of Made in China, but in fact contained the labor, intelligence, and added value of half a dozen other countries. The new world of trade was no longer about one nation selling goods to another. It had become an intricate network where the boundary between exports and imports grew blurry. A car might carry a Hungarian engine and a transmission from Mexico, control software from the United States, a phone designed in California but soon relying on Southeast Asian factories and Japanese technology. The price of this complexity is that official statistics become distorted. A product crosses multiple borders. Its value is counted and recounted, making the picture of international trade misleading. Governments believe they are running deficits with one country and surpluses with another. But in reality, most of the value is created at intermediary points. The truth is hidden in numbers that seem transparent. But more important is the shift in power. In the past, trade was the story of nations and governments. Now it lies in the hands of transnational corporations, entities whose power exceed the limits of borders. They control supply chains, decide where to produce, where to hire cheap labor, where to place factories for tax incentives. They, not politicians, are the ones rewriting the rules of trade.
Looking back, we see a closed circle from Adam Smith with pins to Ricardo with the puzzle of wine and cloth, then Hamilton and List with protectionism. All revolve around the question of how to allocate resources and capture benefits. But stepping into the 21st century, as giant container ships glide across oceans carrying millions of tons of goods, the question has become, who controls this network and who is left behind? The truth reveals a paradox. The world believed that free trade would bring prosperity to all, but not everyone is strong enough to enjoy the outcome. Some societies consume far less than what they produce, forcing their surplus outward. Others consume more than they create, borrowing and importing to maintain their living standards. That imbalance, once large enough, transforms into political tension, even conflict. From the 18th century pin factory to the iPhone assembly line, the journey of trade is the journey of power, the power of ideas, of policy, of capital, and today the power of invisible networks linking continents. No one can stand outside this game. Every time a container leaves port, it carries not only goods, but also the fate of workers, economies, and relationships between nations. That cycle teaches us one thing. Trade has never been just about buying and selling. It is always a mirror reflecting what lies deep inside societies: inequality, ambition, and fear. Looking at the container stacked high on deck, we see not only goods, but also the undercurrents waiting to erupt. People often think trade is the cause and money merely the consequence. But looking deeply into the waves of history, we see everything unfold in the opposite direction. Whenever capital flows across borders, trade is forced to bend to its path. Whether buyers or sellers truly want it or not, money goes first, goods follow. Take London as an example. In the 19th century, when the central bank there loosened policies so gold could flow out, credit markets opened up, and America across the Atlantic immediately boomed. Agricultural output surged, projects sprang up, land prices soared. But when London tightened and pulled gold back, that prosperity froze instantly. Homes were abandoned, projects left unfinished, workers unemployed. The cycles of boom and bust in a nation seemingly independent were tightly bound to the pulse of a financial center half a world away. Many crises in the United States did not originate from cornfields or small factories, but from shortages of gold reserves in the vaults of the Bank of England. This made the idea of free trade fragile, not because Americans could not produce or sell, but because the door of credit was opened or closed from afar. From that point, researchers began to recognize a familiar pattern. International credit waves were like tides rising from the center and crashing onto the shores of peripheral economies. When the water receded, the ships stranded on the beach appeared jagged and exposed. Again and again, young economies swayed to a rhythm they did not control. By the 20th century, a new financial world emerged from the 1950s. Something called the eurodollar was born. These were US dollars outside American territory deposited in European banks to avoid regulation. Those dollars floated freely, unbound by strict rules, opening up an underground playing field. Gradually, this flow of money became the lifeblood of an entire new system. Credit was opened quickly and widely. Inflation in the 1960s and 1970s only tightened everything further. While banks in the United States were capped on interest rates, money market funds emerged, attracting depositors with higher returns. Capital fled the formal system, poured into informal channels, then circulated everywhere. It allowed a single dollar to be replicated into multiple layers of credit like infinite mirrors. Then came the oil shock. Energy prices soared, pouring massive amounts of dollars into the pockets of oil-exporting nations. But those countries could not consume all that money domestically. Excess capital flowed into banks in Europe and Japan, and from there was pushed farther, to Latin America, to countries in the Soviet bloc, even into the most closed economies. People called it petrodollar recycling, a grand experiment never seen before, where oil money fueled growth in distant lands. For a moment, the world believed it had found the formula for limitless prosperity. As long as capital flowed outward, another economy would instantly expand, and global trade would flourish. But behind the growth figures was fragile dependence. No one asked what would happen when the flow reversed. The world entered a turning point. Washington made a decision that seemed technical but triggered an earthquake. Monetary policy was tightened to an unprecedented degree. Real interest rates soared, becoming unbearable burdens for those who had borrowed earlier. A former German chancellor bitterly remarked that interest rates were the highest since the birth of Christ. The consequences unfolded like dominoes. Commodity prices plummeted, leaving resource-exporting nations without revenue to service debt, while borrowing costs multiplied. Loans once seen as symbols of modernization and growth turned into nooses tightening around necks. In August 1982, Mexico was forced to declare it could no longer meet its debt obligations. This was not just a default, it was an alarm bell heard worldwide. Following Mexico, a wave of nations fell into crisis, from South America to Africa. What had been praised as a miracle of global credit now stood revealed as a fragile dependency system. A single sneeze from the center was enough to make the periphery stagger.
During those years, people recognized a harsh truth. Trade did not collapse because goods were lacking or consumers refused to buy. It collapsed because financial arteries were squeezed when capital stopped flowing. Ships sat idle in port. Warehouses filled with goods no one came to collect. The prosperity of the 1970s turned out to be borrowed prosperity. One may blame Mexico or Argentina for excessive borrowing, but look closely and they appear merely as links in a cycle. Petrodollars flowed into European banks, then into developing economies, and returned as interest payments to the center. When the flow moved smoothly, everyone felt wealthy. When it reversed, all were pulled into the vortex. This is a lesson repeated throughout history. Trade tensions cannot be understood by looking only at goods and services. Behind every shipment lie loans, capital flows, and financial commitments binding entire nations. When capital flows are blocked, trade balances shift automatically regardless of domestic willingness to buy or sell. From the cornfields of Iowa to the copper mines of Chile,
From banks in 19th century London to the euro-dollar markets of the 20th century, the story follows a constant rule. Capital flows determine the fate of trade. Credit contracts, interest rates, seemingly invisible forces, hold the power to direct millions of workers, thousands of ships, and the stability of nations. And if anyone still believes that global trade is simply the free exchange of goods, remember 1982, the moment when truth surfaced. Trade wars were only the surface. Deeper down, it was financial battles that decided who enjoyed prosperity and who bore crisis. In the global economic panorama, a formula that seems dry operates like a natural law. A society's trade surplus or deficit is a mirror reflecting the gap between what it saves and what it invests. This need not be abstract. Imagine a small community. If everyone saves more money than can be used for domestic projects, the surplus must find a place to be absorbed beyond the border. Conversely, if the village dreams of building more roads, schools, and factories, but lacks sufficient accumulation, it must import capital and goods, accepting a deficit with the rest of the world. Seen this way, trade is no longer simply exchanging rice for steel or clothes for oil. It becomes a flow, directly linking the heart of saving with the pulse of investment. Depending on the context, that flow can nurture prosperity or spread instability. At times, imbalance brings benefits. Aging societies with shrinking populations and limited profit opportunities save heavily but have nowhere productive to invest. A trade surplus becomes a way to send that excess to youthful, aspiring regions building bridges, factories, and power grids. There, trade deficits are not signs of weakness, but expressions of a stage that requires importing capital and technology to break through. Forced into self-sufficiency, those places would be trapped in cycles of poverty and scarcity. History records tragic examples of nations that chose isolation and paid with a generation of hardship. But the same formula can also produce injustice. Imagine a society where most wealth is concentrated in the hands of a small group whose income far exceeds their needs. They cannot, and do not wish to, spend it all. The surplus becomes forced savings, piled in banks and seeking outlets abroad. Meanwhile, the majority of workers, those who should be sustaining domestic demand, cannot afford to buy. The result? One side saves excessively, the other consumes inadequately. Domestic production cannot find a market and is pushed abroad as a surplus. On the other side are societies that do not produce enough to satisfy the consumption desires of their people. But instead of admitting that the problem lies in distribution, they borrow to fill the gap. Trade deficits in this context become not a development strategy, but a debt trap. Households borrow to maintain living standards, to keep buying goods they could easily afford if income were more fairly distributed. Here is where saving and investment reveal their paradoxical face. A society may grow wealthy through a surplus while making most of its people poorer. Another may grow through deficits while laying the groundwork for future financial crises. The numbers in statistical tables, savings, investment, deficits, surpluses, are in fact deeply human stories about who gets to spend, who must tighten their belts, who carries debt, and who accumulates assets. Seen from this angle, international trade no longer appears as a cold numerical flows. We see faces, life stories, and the threads that bind one social group to another. Surpluses and deficits are only the surface. The true depth lies in who holds the power to decide the allocation of a society's income and how that power is used to shape the fate of millions. After the political upheavals of the late 1980s, a vast country was forced to find a new balance between control and growth. Market reforms improved the material lives of hundreds of millions. Yet beneath the spectacular growth figures lay a difficult paradox. The share of household consumption in national output steadily declined. Incomes rose, but the sense of prosperity did not rise proportionately, for the power to decide spending was gradually shifted away from households and toward investment and production.
In the 1990s, a new policy era deepened this shift. The financial system, the fiscal structure, and even the labor market were redesigned to enforce high savings. Wages and pensions were held down while the production sector was pumped with resources. This was not only an economic choice, but also a survival strategy for a government emerging from a crisis of legitimacy. In 1994, a major devaluation changed everything. The currency fell from 5.8 to the dollar to 8.7, and then it was kept almost fixed for more than a decade. Throughout this period, the currency remained undervalued relative to the country's true productive capacity, creating an artificial advantage for exports. Goods flooded global markets, but the price was borne by workers. Their real incomes were eroded. They worked harder and produced more, yet what they held in their hands did not reflect the sweat they had poured in. The Asian financial crisis of 1997 to 1998 made this strategy even more rigid. As neighboring economies collapsed under the pressure of capital flight, this country chose to hold the exchange rate peg firmly. Stability was placed above all else, even if it meant sacrificing domestic consumption. Once again, ordinary citizens became the shield, absorbing the costs so the economy could avoid the chaos that engulfed Indonesia or Thailand. Within less than 15 years, the country went from running a trade deficit to flipping into a giant surplus. By 2005, the surplus had reached the equivalent of 6% of total output, and at its peak in 2007-2008, the surplus jumped to nearly 10%. These numbers astonished the world, but few saw their roots. It was a quiet transfer of wealth from hundreds of millions of households to factories, corporations, and the national foreign exchange reserves. The central bank became a machine for collecting dollars. Because the private sector was blocked from sending money abroad, all foreign currency inflows had to be pushed into official reserves. Trillions of dollars piled up in vaults, while farmers lost their land to make way for industrial zones, and workers in factories received only subsistence wages. This was a strange transformation. The nation grew richer rapidly, but many families felt themselves growing poorer. During this period, environmental costs were accepted as part of the formula. Land was seized with meager compensation. Air and rivers were sacrificed in exchange for growth. Local governments viewed surpluses and investment as achievements, while the small daily injustices were brushed out of official reports. Household consumption as a share of the whole economy fell to its lowest point in 2010, lower than any major economy had ever recorded. At that time, the trade surplus was not just the result of skillful policy, it was a mirror reflecting a society willing to let hundreds of millions bear the tightening in exchange for a firm position on the global stage. After the peak of 2007-2008, the world fell into a global financial crisis. The country's nominal surplus began shrinking from about $420 billion in 2008. The current account surplus fell to less than half in the following period. On the surface, many believed the imbalance had been solved, but a closer look at the structure reveals a different story. In fact, the surplus in manufacturing was even larger than before. The difference lay on the import side. In the 2000s, the country imported a huge quantity of machinery and manufactured goods for domestic consumption and investment. But after 2008, the trend reversed. Imports of manufactured goods for domestic needs dropped from around 23% of national output to below 10%. This did not mean that people suddenly used fewer computers, phones, or cars. It reflected policies of localization and import substitution, pulling supply chains inside the country and producing domestically what had once been purchased from abroad. This shift made the surplus look smaller from the outside, but in essence, the country still exported most of the wealth it created. The manufacturing factories, nurtured by exchange rate policies and credit support, were now large enough to compete globally. Meanwhile, household demand continued to be suppressed by distribution systems and regulations. To maintain stability, massive inflows of foreign currency continued to pour into the central bank, pushing reserves to trillions of dollars. But reserves cannot just sit idle. They were exported back out in the form of infrastructure investment, credit, and contracts under global projects. The Belt and Road Initiative became a way to absorb the surplus, turning it into a tool of diplomacy and influence. Meanwhile, people at home again witnessed a new paradox. The wealth they created was turned not into schools, hospitals, or safety nets, but into high-speed railways in Africa, seaports in Southeast Asia, or power plants in South Asia. The nation expanded outward, but domestic inequality quietly widened. Researchers have repeatedly emphasized that only one sustainable path exists: shifting assets and income from the state sector, local governments and state-owned enterprises, into the hands of households. That means land reform, hukou reform, giving more rights to labor unions, and a fairer tax system. Without this, the economy will continue relying on debt to sustain growth. And when the debt ceiling is reached, the cycle of imbalance will return. Year 1989. The wall that once divided Berlin collapsed. For many people, it was a symbol of freedom, but for Germany, it was also a gateway into an unprecedented socio-economic experiment. The two halves of the country, one that had immersed itself in the market economy for decades, the other that had existed under a centralized model, now had to join together in a single body. When unifying the currency, the government chose an exchange rate of 1-to-1 between the East and West mark. A decision that seemed symbolic turned out to carry enormous destructive power. Labor costs in East Germany suddenly became higher than in West Germany, while productivity was many times lower. Within just 2 years, 2/3 of East German industry collapsed, factories shut down, production lines were dismantled, and workers lost their jobs. More than 6% of the East German population left their homeland in search of opportunities in the West. The Treuhand Agency was created and tasked with restructuring and privatizing a vast number of state-owned enterprises. In reality, it became the symbol of a massive sell-off. Thousands of companies were dissolved or sold at symbolic prices. The state bore enormous losses, while communities once dependent on industry were left with empty factory shells. Growth plummeted after the initial shock. From 1991 to 1997, Europe's largest economy increased by only 1 to 3% annually, the weakest period since the 1950s. The press called Germany the sick man of Europe. The pride of an industrial power turned into a sense of insecurity. Reunification not only caused output to fluctuate, but also shifted the balance of power within society. Labor unions, once strong, began to weaken. The share of workers covered by collective bargaining agreements fell from over 80% in the mid-1990s to below 45% today. The collective voice faded. Meanwhile, tax and welfare policies favored high-income groups, and the wealth gap between homeowners and renters widened. The central bank recorded an unusual phenomenon. The national saving rate rose, but not because everyone saved more. More than 1/4 of that increase came from income being transferred from those inclined to spend to those who only accumulated. In other words, the enrichment of the upper class went hand in hand with weakening household purchasing power. In stores, demand stagnated, but in the accounts of the wealthy, money piled up. All of these developments created a paradox. A newly unified nation, which should have needed strong consumption to heal, instead ended up with people tightening their spending. When domestic demand was insufficient, the surplus output had to find markets abroad. And so the seeds of a long-term trade surplus were sown from the very social fractures within the nation. After years of turmoil, Germany entered the early 21st century with a series of reforms named after dry reports and plans. But their effects spread into every family. The guiding philosophy could be summed up in one slogan: more jobs with lower wages. The welfare system, once considered a source of pride, was shortened and tightened. Unemployment benefits that could previously last for years were now limited. For most under 55, only 12 months remained. After that, anyone who hadn't found a job was forced to accept minimum support accompanied by strict conditions. Flexible, part-time, and precarious contracts spread. Workers had few choices: either accept low-wage jobs or be pushed aside.
These policies achieved their goals on paper. Unemployment dropped, jobs increased. But the price was the compression of the entire wage structure. Economic growth did not translate into better living standards for the majority, but accumulated in the hands of a small group with capital and assets. National savings increased further, but mainly because those who already had much accumulated even more. Household consumption therefore remained weak, not reflecting the potential of Europe's largest economy. When the domestic market could no longer absorb all output, the surplus inevitably flowed outward. Before the 2008 crisis, German capital flooded into southern Europe, fueling real estate and consumption booms in Spain, Greece, and Portugal. These countries seemed to grow richer, but were in fact borrowing from the future. When the bubble burst, they fell into debt crises, and German banks absorbed huge losses. After the crisis, things became even more paradoxical. The deficit countries were forced to tighten their belts, cut public and private spending, and reduce imports. They shifted from trade deficits to surpluses, not through strong growth, but by suppressing their own populations. The entire Eurozone, under Germany's strong influence, turned into a massive external surplus machine. About 4% of the region's output was pushed outward for the rest of the world to absorb. At home, the government followed a path of fiscal discipline. From 2014, the finance ministry proudly announced no new borrowing, the black zero. The budget surplus reached 2% of output, even as infrastructure deteriorated, the internet lagged, and public projects were delayed. The ideal of a balanced budget became a goal in itself, overshadowing the need for future investment. All of this brought Germany to a strange position, a manufacturing powerhouse, rich on paper, but with weak household purchasing power, lagging infrastructure, and an expanding external surplus. The path differed from China's, but the destination was similar. Income distribution conflict, suppressed domestic consumption, and a forced push of surplus onto the world. When such surpluses accumulate for too long, they become burdensome for other economies and sources of international tension. But looking deeper, they are not the inevitable result of superior productivity, but the outcome of political and social choices. Who must tighten their belts? Who gets to accumulate? And who bears the costs? The US dollar is always praised as the crown of global hegemony, but behind that glory lies a burden few want to face. When the world seeks safety in dollar assets, the United States is forced to become a massive issuer of financial obligations. From the late 1990s to mid-2008, foreign central banks and reserve funds amassed more than $4 trillion in U.S. assets. This meant the U.S. had to produce mountains of bonds and commitments, not because of domestic needs, but to absorb the excess savings of the rest of the world. That pressure did not stop at financial figures. It seeped into the daily lives of millions of families. When international capital flowed in, domestic interest rates should have risen to balance them, but instead they fell below 2% in the mid-2000s. At the same time, the current account deficit ballooned to nearly 6% of national output. A stark paradox: the greater the deficit, the cheaper the interest rates. This is not a sign that the United States can borrow cheaply because it is trustworthy, but because it is forced to accept foreign capital regardless of actual domestic demand. That push kept the dollar high. Imported goods flooded the shelves at prices so low that domestic production could no longer compete. Steel, textile, and furniture factories gradually closed in regions facing direct competition. Workers lost jobs or accepted low wages. But living needs did not disappear, and to fill the gap, credit boomed. Borrowing was no longer an option, but a condition to maintain living standards. Banks replaced unions. Credit cards replaced wage increases in suburban streets. Houses sprang up densely, bought with easy loans. House prices soared, creating a false sense of wealth. Many believed they were progressing,
but in reality, they were sliding on thin ice. The simple truth: the housing bubble was not driven by domestic demand, but by international pressure forcing the U.S. to provide safe assets. Homes became disguised bonds for the rest of the world. Whenever the dollar is praised as the ultimate reserve currency, it must be remembered that this privilege comes with a trade-off. The U.S. is forced into trade deficits, required to provide financial assets for the world, and the price is the erosion of domestic jobs. From abandoned factories in the Midwest to households loaded with debt, the story stems from the same cause: the dollar's special status. This is not a medal, but a yoke. When the world seeks safety in dollars, American citizens become the burden. They consume on credit, produce deficits, and to maintain global order, accept the loss of part of their industrial base. A strong currency sustaining a vulnerable economy is the essence of the costly burden few want to acknowledge. After the housing bubble burst and the 2008 global financial crisis spread, many expected the system to self-correct. U.S. deficits should shrink, domestic production should recover. But reality went the opposite way. The deficit lingered at 2–3% of annual output like an unhealing wound. Per capita consumption remained 12% below pre-crisis levels. Housing investment never returned to mid-2008 levels. Public investment, which should have offset declines, was halved. Manufacturing plants, the heart of industry, still produced less than in 2008, even by 2018. Meanwhile, the manufacturing trade deficit exceeded 4% of national output, the deepest level since the 19th century. Another shock came from Europe after 2014. The European Central Bank's quantitative easing caused a flood of savings to flow abroad. U.S. bonds alone attracted about $800 billion. Unlike before 2008, this money was not recycled back. The dollar rose about 20%, suffocating U.S. exports. Meanwhile, imports surged. Once again, the U.S. was forced to bear the shortfall in other spending. Underlying these fluctuations is the global shortage of safe assets. Surplus countries and wealthy individuals continuously seek dollar bonds because nowhere else can provide both liquidity and trust. But the harsh truth: whenever they find safety in bonds, Americans pay the price in lost jobs, trade deficits, and mounting debt. There was another choice. Instead of allowing households to borrow and inflate the housing bubble, the federal government could have borrowed directly, spending on infrastructure, education, and industry. External deficits would still exist because global capital needed shelter, but the domestic structure would differ. Workers with stable jobs, cities with new transport systems, and a less fragile society. But that path was not chosen. Instead, private credit continued to bear the role, replacing policy.
Looking back, the U.S.'s special role in the global system is not just an advantage, it is a trap. All inequalities in surplus countries, where labor is wage-compressed and consumption restrained, are reflected in the U.S. as deficits, debt, and lost jobs. A strong dollar symbolizes power, but also bears witness to silent sacrifices in the world's largest economy, operating like a pressure valve for external distortions. A currency desired worldwide is tied to domestic social stratification. That paradox is the costly burden the U.S. carries, both a pillar of global order and the root of instability at home. For decades, whenever trade crises occurred, government's first reflex was to erect tariffs. They believed deficit and surplus numbers could be trimmed with new taxes. But in reality, tariffs are like hastily laid bricks that soon collapse, sometimes widening the cracks. Goods slow, but capital finds its way. Many societies began experimenting with other tools. Some banned foreigners from buying houses, fearing bubbles from excess foreign capital. Some considered taxes on incoming capital flows. In Washington, proposals emerged for a market access fee to make holding dollars less attractive, thereby nudging trade balances toward equilibrium. Yet the difficulty lies elsewhere. The dollar is not merely a national currency. it has become a pillar of the entire system. When central banks in Tokyo, Frankfurt, Beijing, or Riyadh all want to hold U.S. Treasury bonds, America itself has no choice. It must supply these safe assets. Regardless of domestic economic consequences, the harsh truth remains. What is praised as hegemonic privilege turns into a costly burden. The U.S. no longer accounts for half of the global economy as it did post-war. Now it holds less than a quarter, yet must bear the central role as before, like an aging body forced to carry an entire crowd. Internal political mechanisms make the burden harder to relieve. Financial elites, who directly benefit from international capital flows, always support a strong dollar. This mindset is deeply embedded in policy, becoming a national belief. The leaders must pay the price. In that short statement lies both helplessness and acceptance. Meanwhile, imbalances do not disappear. Just look at Europe after 2000. Belt-tightening, wage compression, and household consumption increasing at only half the rate of output. Eurozone gradually became a massive surplus bloc comparable to the imbalance China reached before the financial crisis. And as a rule, that surplus sought refuge in dollars. When the pieces are put together, we see that international trade is not distorted by innate productivity differences, as is commonly thought. It is distorted by inequality within each society. When workers are deprived of their fair share, when welfare is cut, when money accumulates at the top without being spent, the entire economy becomes an involuntary export machine, and that surplus, by inertia, flows to the United States. To address the root cause, tariffs or capital controls are only temporary. The problem lies in the distribution structure. As long as wealth remains concentrated in a minority, as long as workers and retirees have not been given back their share, trade wars will repeat themselves, changing form but not essence. After the years of crisis, the world looked to the U.S. with the expectation that it would once again rescue the system. And indeed, the federal government could have chosen a different path. It could have borrowed and spent directly to upgrade infrastructure, reindustrialize, and improve income distribution. In that way, external deficits would still exist because global capital needs a safe haven, but they would reflect investment in a sustainable foundation rather than fueling asset bubbles. Yet that choice was ignored. Instead, private credit and financial market easing continued to act as substitutes, resulting in a familiar cycle. Household debt increased, housing was inflated again, and the economy became more fragile before the next shock. Looking at Europe, we see a different scenario, but the essence remains the same. From 2010, austerity policies were widely imposed. People were forced to cut spending just when they needed it most. Wages were compressed, welfare reduced, so purchasing power increased at only half the rate of output. As a result, Eurozone became a large surplus bloc, but at the cost of a generation being sacrificed. Global imbalances, once centered on China, gradually shifted to the heart of Europe. The truth is that surpluses are not proof of superior productivity. They often indicate that income has been drained from those inclined to spend and concentrated in classes that only accumulate. The rich get richer, firms accumulate more surplus, but society loses the natural incentive to consume. That surplus, unable to find an outlet domestically, is pushed across borders. If surplus countries want to escape this vicious cycle, they must do the hardest thing: return wealth to workers, to retirees, to groups with both the capacity and need to consume. This means reforming land, taxes, unions, and the invisible barriers holding power in the hands of the few. Only then can the economy rely on genuine domestic demand. Instead of living off exporting surpluses for others to bear with the U.S., the short-term path could be increased federal spending, expanding the central bank's dollar swap network to reduce pressure on global foreign reserves. But in the long term, even they cannot continue to act as a pressure valve for the rest of the world. A strong dollar is no longer a guarantee of safety, but a symbol of an unfair system. The core of every trade war does not lie in export taxes or technological gaps. It lies in the hidden class struggle within each country.
when distribution is distorted, when people are forced to tighten belts so elites can accumulate. The numbers of surpluses and deficits are only the surface of a deeper truth. To end trade wars, one must end the internal struggle, where decisions are made about who can consume, who must sacrifice, and who bears the world's imbalances. Thank you for accompanying me to the very last pages of this story. Listening to a book is not just about absorbing information. It is an experience where every idea collides with memory, concern, and hope. I invite you to pause and reflect on what you have heard. Do you feel this book is only about trade numbers, or does it actually touch the lives of individuals, their jobs, wages, and the sense of security or vulnerability in society? Share your impressions, observations, even critiques to make this conversation truly meaningful. If you have another book you wish to hear recounted, one that has unsettled, confused, or simply piqued your curiosity, suggest it. Your suggestion opens new journeys, where I can continue to accompany you in decoding big ideas and perhaps untold paradoxes. The most important lesson I take from this book is that the conflicts we see on the surface, in trade, politics, and diplomacy, ultimately stem from hidden struggles within society. Who benefits, who sacrifices, and who bears the rest of the world's imbalances? Understanding this, we become less naive about simple promises and more courageous in confronting the root of the problem. Once again, thank you for taking the time to listen. We will meet again in another book on another journey. I look forward to hearing your reflections after closing today's book.